lives. Your transformation starts here.
Welcome to Transforming Lives. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Elizabeth A. Wells, a Harvard Strategic Data Project Fellow, a dedicated educator with over 15 years of experience in transforming education through data. Now, Dr. Wells is from Hamilton, Mississippi. She holds a PhD in math education and brings expertise as a district math specialist, data analysis, and drives equity and provides improvement for all students, from analyzing ACT data to map results. She's helping reshape data-driven strategies. Dr. Wells is passionate about creating lasting change in classrooms across the state. Get ready for an insightful conversation with the leader who's redefining how we use data to empower students and the community. This is 50 educators from 50 states.
The weather.
It is nice and cold in the great state of Mississippi on this Monday at 2:30 p.m. It's December, so it should be cold. We're going to have a reasonably cool Christmas, but it doesn't feel good at all.
I agree. That's the unique thing about Mississippi. I think I got out of my vehicle one day, was kind of thinking to myself, like, what is it, what is this weather going to do? Is it going to stay kind of, I think it was warm at that point or pleasant? And I'm like, it's getting closer to Christmas. Like, what's going on? Like, we're going to get snow. Right. What's going to happen?
We don't know. That's the thing.
Right. Right.
We don't know. We really don't. I mean, like next week or even on Christmas Day, we could get snow or we could get ice or we could be able to wear our shorts on Christmas Day. Yes.
You're precise in your answer. Don't know.
It's always a toss-up. Yes.
Right. Well, awesome. So I want to jump into our questions. When I think about and the unique thing about this is that when I'm interviewing educators from across our nation, I'm looking at I'm allotting a number of guests that I'm going to have per state. And I said, you know what, Mississippi, I'm going to have to do that one right. So I can't put a number on Mississippi. In fact, right. I'm trying to coin a subtitle for Mississippi in terms of this podcast. So I'm excited to have you on, and I want to jump right into the questions. When you think about your professional journey, could you share with us your professional journey and what led you to specialize in assessment, educational assessments of all things, and accountability? Tell us about it. I think everybody wants to hear about it.
Okay. Well, I believe, let's start with, I started off with an undergrad in biology. It has nothing to do with math at all. And I wish that at some point someone had been very clear and transparent with me about how, let's do a little something different here. But when I started going down the path of math education, one of the things that I saw with data was that there was this thing, the NAEP data, where we could see like this achievement gap that we would see, right? Mm-hmm. So I always have been of the mindset that data can always tell us a story about something. But let's fast forward to, let's say, 2016. I moved to Madison County Schools and I was a math specialist. And so I became very, very interested in the ACT data. And so I began to ask, like, hey, can I get the entire list of all of the scores along with the sub scores? And they gave me the data. And so I began to play around with it, and I began to have different views or different ways to visualize that data to begin to tell a story about it. And so from there, at some point, I was sitting as a math specialist in a class with a teacher, and she was teaching an Algebra 1 class. And what I could see was that there were some students who were struggling or having challenges with some of the content, and they had made like a 4 or a 5 on the 8th grade assessment. So yeah, they were good to be placed in that class. But then I began to look at, well, what content or what domains, what concepts directly feed into Algebra 1 from middle school to Algebra 1, right? And so when you look at that and you break it down, you can see off of those blueprints back from 2016 up until they recently changed them, like during COVID.
Right.
You can see where on that 8th grade assessment, that assessment was with, especially with that performance task, it was transformational geometry.
Right.
So you could have a student make a 4 or a 5 in 8th grade on that 8th grade assessment, get placed number 1, and you would wonder, have you looked at functions like ever in life? Possibly. And it's not because the student was without, it was just that the emphasis is not placed on it in 8th grade, because that teacher in the 8th grade math, they're held accountable to their scores in that class. So absolutely, that teacher was going to teach transformational geometry until April, until they took the test, right? And so I began to look at that data and unpack it and create this longitudinal look on how did students perform in the domains that fed into, or that actually lead up into Algebra 1 in 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. And then you could see how some of those, like across the board, some of those students were not even maybe getting 50% of those categories correct. And that's okay, because where is the emphasis placed? That, you know, I get that part, but you're placing students in Algebra 1 thinking that they would be ready to like hit the ground running day 1. And so that was not always the case. There were some supports that were needed. And so that would be like my first, I would think my first official space of like really getting into assessment and accountability, because I began to look at the end result, that EOC at the high school level, that they're responsible for being proficient or advanced on, or at minimum passing, and what happened mathematically up until they got there. And so how are we actually placing students? So that's kind of how I really got on the team, was because of the way that I began to look at data. And so from there I was playing with a lot of our state level data, looking at some of our benchmark data along with ACT data as well. And after that, we had someone on the team to retire. And so I just transitioned into really learning the accountability model, and it just kind of took off from there. Took off from there.
So we're not going to skip over this statement that you said. You took the NAEP, data, and you got a smile on your face when you said it. Okay, let me pause to say that. And you were able to go in and to examine that data, and that's different, because being able to disaggregate that type of data is different, because you have to look at it on a national scale at this point. It's one thing to look at it on the state level, but you start looking at the national level to see, or to really make a proper judgment on what's happening. You know, your heart.
No, we'll see it. NAEP came up during I would read these articles in the Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, and they would often mention NAEP data. And I'm like, what is this? And so when you begin to go to
1 second, we're recording, we're good.
Okay.
I don't know if it's are you able to hear me clearly? Because I'm not.
I can hear you. Oh, okay.
Okay. Something is happening. Okay, talk one more time.
NAEP data.
Yeah, I can't.
It's not, do you need me to try to get on a different device? Do you
Like
think
you're
it's my device?
choppy.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
My Wi-Fi.
I'm-
So yeah, like with NAEP data, one of the things that I would look at in some of the articles in the literature I would read in my graduate program, it
mhm.
talked about the achievement gap, right? And
Yeah,
so they were using this language about the achievement gap and where Mississippi would rank also nationally, and a lot of it was using NAEP data.
yeah,
Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. There are some of our constituents, they're like, NAEP data is horrible. Look at their methodology. Like, it doesn't follow best practices.
yeah.
However, it still tells us and gives us a snapshot of something.
Right.
And the snapshot that it gives us, that's how we're measuring ourselves. And that's how other people measure us as well. And then when you look at some of the items on the NAEP, they're actually really good questions. So
Right.
I think that it's a good tool to use, or it has been a good tool to use to be able to tell us something. So when I was looking at that data, I would begin to see where I didn't know there was this thing that was called an achievement gap, for one thing, because as a math person who loves math, I would be in all of the math classes,
Correct.
right? And I would work hard and I would do the best that I could, and I would get some decent grades, right? And I'm a person of color. I'm Black,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah.
would I would I didn't understand. That was just something that was very interesting to me. I had never looked at it before in that way. And so when I would look at that data, I could see where Black students did not perform as well as their white counterparts. Students
Mm,
from in a low socioeconomic status, or students that received free and reduced lunch did not perform as well as those who did not. And so when you look at the intersection of both of those subgroups,
right.
you begin to see an even more interesting picture on the NAEP data. And what we can see now, I think, also across the state, that some of that translates into what we can see in our state results as well. When you look at the data, even available through MDE, when we look at some of our subgroup data as well. So yeah, I always thought that that was interesting when we're looking at this national assessment and how students perform. And I think, not I think, when you look at some of the ACT data, we can see some similar trends in that as well. So my thing was, let's get out of this space of, you begin to start hearing it being like this. They call it having a fetish with gaps, because we're just going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it. Well, we know it exists. What are we going to do now to do something about it? So like digging, so that's when it takes a different look or a different space. You have to get into a different space of like really getting that. I don't want to say the source of the problem, but the source of what the data is telling us.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. With this past summer at our state conference, with the former employer, we actually looked at that data from a
Mm-hmm.
national standpoint and compared it to where Mississippi is right now. We looked at it,
Mm-hmm.
what was the prior scores, and now one of the things that I stated was, when you go out of town and you get into conversation with people in that particular town that you are, and they ask you where you from, where you from,
Mm-hmm.
and then you say Mississippi, and then they go and emphasize Mississippi. uh
Yes, Mississippi. Yes.
and then they proceed to talk about being the lowest, last ranked in education, but now that's no longer a
Right.
conversational piece, because we've surpassed, I forgot how many states, to now
Mhm.
our NAEP
Mhm.
scores have improved significantly. And
Absolutely.
over the,
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's
Yes.
interesting.
Yes. I had people asking me about, well, what are y'all doing with English? You're doing so well with English. And I'm thinking, I look at math a lot. So
Yeah. Yeah, right. I'm
I
with you.
can't speak to what's happening instructionally with English, but we can look at those scores if you want to. But no, Mississippi has definitely made some amazing improvements on those national assessments. That's for sure. Yes. Yes. Agreed.
Yeah. And another piece that you talked about was looking at this progression that happens with students that enter middle school. In fact, if we go back to elementary school, but that's another conversation. Stop,
It's
Tony.
another.
Stop, Tony. Let's stick
Mhm,
with middle school to high school.
mhm.
When I started to look at their results from the state tests, and for those eighth graders particularly, they would scoring fours and fives,
Yep.
and you're like, okay. But now, once you get in there and you start looking at algebra, and you
Mhm.
started to notice that, okay, all right, there's some fuzzy looks right now from the
It's
student,
fuzzy.
and they're like,
Yeah.
but the unique thing about this is that when you look at the eighth grade standards,
Mhm.
that function standards, 1, 2, 3, all of those standards, those are standards that are really, I wouldn't say that they were difficult for teachers, but I just saw from experience that it was almost a new world for children to see those standards in eighth grade. But then when they got to algebra 1, you're like, kids are like, where did this come from?
What? Yes, yes.
Understand it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What are these variables? Why are we
Right. The variables is a conversation within itself.
Yes,
Oh my goodness.
yes, yes, yes,
Oh
yes. Talking
wow.
about f of x is not f multiplied by x, and that's a whole different conversation. When you start talking about the structure in mathematics, which is important, right? It's very important, but I think it's the way you transition. You have to transition to it, right? So, and showing how this is what this is when we look at this specific notation, that is what it means. But a lot of times you can have challenges with trying to convince students about, well, uh, why it's important.
Oh yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
why it's important that we have this structure also. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I,
So
I'm gonna leave that structure. You led me into another conversation about
my
the structure.
apologies.
That
My
structure.
apologies.
We'll stay there just for a moment. The whole idea of structure and
Mhm,
looking at the context, because a lot of those standards are in Algebra 1 are stated that they should be in real world context. So you're
mhm.
making this huge jump for students, uh,
Absolutely.
where in many cases the exposure is not there, and that foundational understanding, the algebraic understanding
Mhm.
has definitely a gap in it. So
Eh, it does, but then you go back to thinking about how much emphasis in sixth, seventh, and eighth is put on algebraic reasoning. And then specifically, let's not even throw in the summers of we're not doing anything. we're the learning loss that occurs during the summer. Now, let's also combine that with learning loss from COVID, that we're not talking about the long term impact that COVID has had on a generation of students. That it, let's keep it real. I know we don't want to bring it back up. We're like, we got to move on. Yes, we want to move on, but we also need to acknowledge that we have the students who are in the educational system now, they have about 2 years, possibly for sure, of just some serious challenges with engaging in the educational environment in a way that will really support learning. And so I don't mean it and I know that everybody was doing the best that they
right,
could. I
yeah,
know no one had all of the answers, because you have
no,
this balance of trying to keep people safe, keep
right,
students safe, keep teachers safe, keep everybody safe, keep the people at home safe, and also making sure you're educating those students. Now, all I know is that when in some spaces, when people left in March, and I'm not going to speak for Mississippi. Let me speak for my little nephew who was in Arkansas at the time. When he
Oh,
left school in March, he had a nice, long, fun summer. And he passed,
oh,
I think he was in the 4th grade then. He still passed the 4th grade. Now, though we had some checks and balances and had a level of accountability, but at the time, my sister, she was able to work remotely.
mhm,
Now, but think about parents that could not work remotely, and
yeah,
they're having to deal with having to educate their children at home, deal with the education of their children, but also making sure that they can put food on the table. And I think about that, how that specific space and time, how it had such a major impact on the educational setting that we will continue to see a certain level of educational loss from
correct.
COVID that will impact students, I think, until those babies graduate. Because I just that's an opinion, though. That's an opinion, and I don't have a lot of data to back it up. So a statement without data is just an opinion, right?
Right. Well, I'm going to give you my opinion. And my personal opinion from my experience that I saw something unique with last year's 6th graders. Um, last year's 6th graders for me were I was just scratching my head like what's going on here because
Mm-hmm.
their literacy uh, comprehension was low,
Mm-hmm.
which in return you can kind of many times you can kind of skate over that partially in mathematics, but it was bleeding over in mathematics too because
Mm.
in sixth grade there, you know, although it's not a lot of the standards are not in the application form, but you still have to read those questions, you know,
Yes. Yes.
problem. And I'm like, what is going on?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And just my little personal conversations with kids. Yeah. At that time, this is when, of course, when COVID hit, this is the 3rd grade, 4th grade for them. So
Yep. Yep. We don't have a 3rd grade gate. we don't, we we we're gonna go based off of that 3rd benchmark that you took in March, and kind of hope that it gives us a good picture of what. And that's just for places that had already given that benchmark, right? Like it's and when you think about across the board, like I often think about how I am aware that that where I work, we're fortunate enough to be able to give benchmarks 3 times a year,
yeah,
have a team. Like I'm on the assessment and accountability team. I am a data analyst for our district, and I am aware that the role that I have is not something that other places have. Like other places are paying, and there's so much data. See, that's the thing. Like there's so much data that's out there. That's why you have 4 and 5 companies that are like, hey, try our product, get real-time results. And they're going to charge their value and their perceived value and what they're offering. However, it's so much data that we want to know and get this real-time feedback to. I am grateful that I work in a place where I can take that data and give some feedback on about it.
right,
But every place, I acknowledge, every place does not have that. Every place doesn't have it.
right,
Mm-hmm.
right. And your value, you know, even, you know, I definitely would toot your horn and toot your district for having that because if you don't, if you're data illiterate, you know,
Mm,
if
mm.
if you make the statement that data should drive your instruction
Come on
and you're
now.
not data literate or illiterate, then there's going to be a problem. Then who's driving?
Who's driving it? Who's driving it? Right. Right. And
Yeah,
and and and, and so how do you make decisions if you're not looking at when we took and it data tells a story. That's the thing. Like when we collect data and when we, let's say if you do, like when we've got the state test results back in June, and with that initial run, we noticed they were a little bit lower. Everybody's like, what happened?
Right.
So, which has led to a whole lot of other things. Now we only have one vendor, right?
Right.
But when you get those results back, I'm sorry, I apologize. I will go on a tangent myself. But if you're not, but in that same vein, if you're not thinking about historically, when we got that data back, if we didn't look at each school historically and how they have typically performed on an assessment like this, then would we have been able to make a decision or be able to get feedback and say, hey, something doesn't look right?
Right.
So there has to be in some space where whatever data that you have, you understand what that data actually tells you, along with the limitations. Because that one test score is not going to tell you everything that you need to know about a student, but we do know that test score means a whole lot in the context of all the things. Right? Like we're like, it doesn't tell us the whole picture. You were right, it does not. The system that we're in right now, though, it means that I need those test scores to look a certain way. We need to have certain growth. We need to have certain levels of proficiency, because what's going to be put out to the public is a letter grade.
Yes.
And that, yes, is a letter grade. And so when you speak to data literacy, though, what I would like in a perfect world, we would be able to say, if you have this letter grade, this is what this means, and that everybody would be interested in knowing what that letter grade actually means and where it comes from. But that's a completely different world and a whole different conversation that I don't know if we have time to get into today, or that may not even be the space for it. But then no, and I'm serious, like just the messaging that goes out with letter grades. Now, I will say, super excited about the performance of the district that I work in, because we have seen some historical scores. I think that at Shirley Simmons, Mr. Adams, first time ever, they were in A. There's another school, East Flora Elementary, Dr. Marsha Peoples, at their school, they became an A for the first time, which was so awesome. And on the other side, I'm on the other end looking at their data the entire time, and I'm like, woo, this looks great. And so I was super excited. Like you can see the progression of things in terms of like how they have worked really hard to meet this standard that's been set by the state, and that they're doing really well and working really hard. But what some of the other things that we don't necessarily think about is that those cuts can change in terms of like, there's something where once you reach a certain percent that's an A or a certain number of above a C, we're going to just shift those cuts. And just only thing people are going to know, like coming up then, well, that school was an A, now they're a B. What happened? And you're thinking that, oh, they just may not be as good as they used to be. And I know that we do as a district, we work really hard to make sure that we are communicating with our stakeholders.
Right.
But then how much time does someone have to process? Well, the state makes this rule, or legislators have made this rule where we will change how we assign letter grades. I think about the impact of how, I believe it was a federal designation where, at one point you could make over 100% growth on your low 25 and growth overall. And you had places their proficiency was less than 50%. And I'm talking about statewide, right?
Yeah.
Proficiency, not so much. They didn't necessarily get the points in proficiency, but boy, they could grow those students. Correct. And so you're talking about over 100% in possibly 4 different boxes on a 700-point accountability model for grades 3 through 8, right?
Yes.
And so, but now we're taking away. If you, I don't care if you like have kept all of those students proficient and advanced and got the 1.25, the maximum number of growth points you can get. And so you can end up with 125% in terms of that growth box. We're going to max you out at 100 because the Fed said that that's what we have to do. And that's not knocking anything. Like, that's just, you got to have rules, you got to have regulations. I get that part. But then if that's where other schools have been getting all of the majority of their points from, then how does that impact the perception of the public in terms of, well, we knew that they were like an A or a B one year, and now they're a C. What happened? Like, we begin to get into this space of having to make sure that we have the appropriate messaging, but also as a stakeholder, if I'm a parent,
Right.
I'm not diving into the accountability model. I just want to know, am I sending my child to a good school or not? Right? And I'm going to go based off of this letter grade system that's been created, but also to me, there is a little bit of a flaw in it, just a little bit, that once you all achieve this certain thing, then we're just going to reset it all.
Right.
And that to me is just, I will save that opinion for a different day. It just presents some challenges because I don't feel, if you say that once we all reach this certain level, we're going to do some resets of the cuts, then you're also saying there has to be winners, but you got to have losers as well.
Yeah.
And I find that to be problematic.
And it is because once you reset those scores, how do you inform the state of those changes? And it's one thing to inform someone of something, but it's another thing to adequately prepare them to adjust to this new, whether that's, going back to what you said about the different domains where you have 100 for low 25 growth of all and proficiency, and now you're capping it out at 100. Well, now that student that you have on your roster that has scored proficient or has scored a 4, let's say they scored a 5, right? Scored advanced. And that student, for some reason, doesn't perform as that child has historically performed. And now, you lose 2 or 3 students that were advanced now to go to proficient. Now it hits
multiple boxes.
Right.
No, it does. And so you bring up a good point. There's this one piece of talking about messaging with stakeholders. I believe that anytime someone, if a parent has a question about the overall picture of performance and all of that, our district will have conversations. We have people in place to have those conversations, but still, you start getting into the place of getting into the weeds of things.
Right.
And so it's like, to a certain extent, it's just, I just want to know, are we going to be an A or not?
Right, that's it.
Get me to an A. And I get it as if I were a parent and I was paying to live somewhere where I wanted my child to go to an A-rated school in an A-rated district, I'd want you to, hold up to that end of the bargain as well. But to a certain extent, I think we don't, there are just challenges that are in place it's not something that, when you just look at that final number, there has to be context to it. And so to your point too, when you're talking about students that are, when you speak to the student that came in at a 5 in 8th grade math, and then they ended up being a 4, let's say just even a 4, still proficient, but they didn't grow. But in 8th grade, they could be a 5. They didn't grow, right? They could be a 5 in 8th grade math, but ended up being proficient in algebra 1. And we're like, well, you lost growth points. What without the context, without the knowledge of what we know as people that play in the math world, that's been our thing, right?
Yeah.
How do you explain to someone, well, really from 8th grade to algebra 1, they're really teaching half of the stuff is completely different. I'm just saying, we had this conversation, transformational geometry. I love it, but it's not going to prepare you to be able to identify the zeros of a function on the graph. It's just not going to. It's not going to help you to factor. It's
right. You're right.
But that's what that performance task in 8th grade was based off of, right? So without that context, we don't know why a teacher her growth may have suffered that year, right? And I think that's part of when we look at data, when we look at the data that we have, we need to be able to support telling the story of what that data actually tells us.
Right.
Data can tell whatever story we want it to tell us, but let's dig into it and get some more context with it as well. Mm-hmm.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Even in our conversation, it's like it's warming my heart because sometimes, maybe an administrator it's not privy to the information. Maybe a district coach is just not privy to the information, and you have to have some type of support. Maybe that's somebody coming from the district office to properly support the person, where it's important to have a team around you so that you're able to make those decisions because climate and culture impacts data. It's just what it
absolutely. Mm-hmm. It does. One of the things, so just when I walk into the schools that I have seen their data go from where they started at in 2022, go from a C to an A. When you walk into those schools, you can see the way admin engage with the students, the way teachers engage with the students. And there is a level of, I have expectations, but I am also, the atmosphere is so unique in terms of, we're here for school, but I also care about you as a student, as a human being, but I also have high expectations for you. And so when you say culture, that's something that I could absolutely see. I can see it in a lot of schools, right? But just when you think about the schools that you've seen this transformation in terms of their letter grades over time, that's something I absolutely can say. That culture in the school is amazing. On top of, we also have another. So I like to shout out like so many different people.
Go ahead,
I
feel
think
free.
they do this amazing work. Another person that all of our administrators work really, really hard. I will say that they work really hard. But Jessica Gostin Smith, because she was in the news, Luther Branson Elementary.
Okay.
She was in not last year, but the year before, because now she's with federal programs. But the year before, she was had been the principal of Luther Branson Elementary for a long time. And so, but her school, small, rural, 100% African American, 100% free and reduced lunch. They were a 600 plus school. Right. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So when you walk into that school, what you would see was she knew all of the students. She had expectations that we're going to teach the standards. And when we take these benchmark assessments, Let's take this data and have conversations with it immediately. And so the way that I would see her engage with setting culture and climate in that space was she was one of the people who, when I would run my accountability calculations,
Yeah.
I like to have somebody to check myself against. She would run her own.
Oh.
Yes,
Ooh,
yes, yes.
yeah.
And I would have conversations with her about, this is who I have that's proficient. We would have those conversations. And if
Yeah.
our numbers were
Data
off,
talk. Yeah.
we would have conversations about why the numbers were off, if it was a student that met FAY versus a student that did
Yeah.
not, all of those pieces. So yeah, but no, that definitely, I know I went on a tangent there, so you're gonna have to
No,
bring
we're
me
good.
back in.
No, that's
I
because
start.
no, we're good. This is a valuable. Go ahead. I don't
I'm
want to cut
sorry.
you
I
off.
just shouting out some of the administrators that I've seen do some very amazing transformational things at their schools. And it's with, when you walk in, you could see the culture
Yeah.
that's there, and what you said, without the appropriate culture and without the right climate for the students, the numbers are just going to be what the numbers are going to be. I think that if you want to see change, you got to have agents of change in place that can see the big picture and just run with it, again, like I've said with Dr. Peoples, Mr. Adams, and Miss Jessica Gostin Smith. Like, I've seen them do amazing things. I will even say, in places where you sometimes can see how people have a vision for, I think that when we talk about culture and climate, we have to think about the amount of time it takes for change to happen. Because I can look at the numbers all day, and it takes a while for things to normalize and level back off, right?
Correct. Yes. Yes.
And so then if I want to actually have change put in place, if you see change happen overnight, I'm going to question, how did that happen? Or what happened? I think anybody would, right? I mean, that's my thought process. Anybody, like, that much change? Because you're having to deal with, when you go to a place and you want to change culture and you want to change the perspective of the people in that space, or just support a different way, it takes many days of consistency and continuing to reinforce things over time. So I think that, saying that we're going to go from an F to an A in 1 year, God performs miracles.
He
But,
does. He does.
but I would wonder how that miracle came about, if that were to happen. But I think that when you think about having small wins and having this progress, but also you're changing that culture, working on changing the mindset in a space, then that takes time. So
It's so much into this, and we're good with our questions. This is rich.
okay.
Because definitely a shout out to your district. I was kind of hesitant if I were going to say this, but it's a shout out to those administrators, because now, as being an educator, you're used to being in a school system, but then as a parent, I definitely have a different perspective of administrator or superintendent's approach, and I'm used to the educator role, but the role as a parent, that was different for me. And I can it changed what it did for me as an educator. It really changed to see the value in leaders. Now, I'm not saying that leaders are just not the administrators, because teachers in the classrooms are leaders.
Right,
District
absolutely.
there are different leaders in there, but I definitely want to say, and even listen to your conversation of the importance, that you place on certain factors within the school is important. It's important, and it's delightful to hear as well. So I just wanted to pause and say that right there.
And
Uh,
and and I think the role that I'm grateful that there are administrators, when I speak with them, I'm like, hey, I want you to look at this report that I created. Can you give me some feedback on it? What would make this more useful? Would you
Yeah.
like for me to come and have a conversation about how we can utilize this? What other data do you need? So for instance, we have somebody that if you ever get the chance to see her run her PLCs is Miss Crystal Chase at Ridgeland High School, because when I tell you she's amazing, she is amazing. But she is one of many who I can have a conversation with about. So when you look at, there are some schools that have a very transient population, right? And the changes in the population of Ridgeland High School over time,
Right. Yeah.
you can see how just stuff has just changed, right?
Correct,
They have a large population, a migrant population, and they have a large number of EL students as well.
Yeah.
And so for them, it's like we having conversations with administrators about like, well, what are you noticing about what's happening, and how can I support you in this, right? So trying to understand how many transfer students do you really get in a year? And how is that impacting, especially at a high school, right? Like that's one of the things that I'm kind of trying to dig into now is when we look at our graduation rates, all graduation rates are not created equally.
Boom.
If they're just not. If my population of students, I'm from Hamilton, Mississippi. Small town, Northeast Mississippi,
Yep.
Monroe County. That population isn't going to change a whole lot.
It's not.
So the students that enter your cohort for the grad rate, you're probably going to be able to keep them and get them out. The likelihood of you having a student that might enter the cohort, let's say midway through 10th grade year, it may not be as likely as maybe, let's say, a high school in Madison County schools, right? At the grad rate of certain schools, I need to have some context in that. No, it's not necessarily the school is not doing their best to get the students out within that very limited 4-year period that the feds give us to get them out. No, you get no extra time for,
No
hey, you had a bad year, nothing.
No grace.
9th grade, get them in, get them out.
Right.
But when you look at the data, like what's going on with the population of students in that area? Is it a transient population? Is it in a space where students are maybe parents are likely to get a job and transition from one county to another, possibly? It's something to think about in the context of when I look at the graduation rate for school A versus school B, what exactly happens in both of those spaces? And when you think about having a transient population, I also think about, well, school A may have a transient population where they get transfer students from private schools that now that they're in high school, do you see where I'm going with this?
I'm clear. I'm crystal clear.
If students are entering this place and they're coming from a high performing private school and now they're entering a public high school, my ability to get them out within 4 years may be slightly different than if I have a student that's transferring from a a school that historically has been in CSI for where they fall in that.
You know, as this conversation has evolved, this is not the end of it. I cut it at a particular point, and you definitely can look in the description to get the other videos. But what I do know is that we had I guess it's just connected with Mississippi people. I don't know, but it's a rich conversation with substance. So, when I think about Mississippi, there is a story that has been told. And the part that has to happen with storytelling is that at some point you have to update people on where the state is. And I can say that she is one that is very knowledgeable with data and with math. And how do you push a school, or how do you push a classroom forward by using data to drive the instruction? She is one. Definitely get in contact with her because she's a rock star. I'm thankful for what she provided, and yeah, man, it was just an old-fashioned good conversation from a person from Coffeyville, Mississippi, and Hamilton. So again, guys, thank you so much for viewing this video. Check out the other videos in the description. And hey, this has been Transforming Lives Podcast, 50 educators from 50 states.